Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this closing session on how to be more gridful. For this panel, we'll be talking about Europe's electricity grid and asking the question, will 50 million heat pumps leave Europe in the dark? My name is Emma, and I'm an associate at BloombergNEF. And it is my pleasure to be moderating this closing session this afternoon. I hope you guys have all had a great day enjoying the fantastic content that we've seen at this event today. Just by way of quick introduction, I am one of the BNEF analysts based in London. I'm responsible for a lot of our work on sector coupling in Europe. So I've spent a lot of my time recently researching electrification, sector coupling, and what it means for our energy systems. And today I am delighted to be joined by four very distinguished panelists, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name on introduction, but first I'd like to introduce Laurent Schmitt, Secretary General at ENTSO-E. Also joining us is Mikel Urizarbarrena from Iberdrola, and Mikel works in the Network Planning and Regulations team. We also have Enrique Vilamitjana, Managing Director at Panasonic AC and Heating in Europe. And last but not least, we have Philippe van Poppel, Group Director for Habitat Domaine, joining us today from EDF. Now, we hear a lot of the time that we can't electrify everything, especially when we're talking about the decarbonisation of the building stock. Another concern that we hear a lot is that, the lights will go out if we put heat pumps everywhere. But is this actually true? So in this session, we'll be asking the experts for their opinions to shed some light on this topic from several different angles. Now, of course, earlier today, we heard that the European Commission now foresees up to 70% of buildings to be heated via electric heating system by 2050. And that means 90 million buildings with higher electricity demand than they have today. And that's excluding the impact of electrified transport in all of this as well. So I want to start by just opening the floor to our panelists, some of whom I know have prepared some short presentations and discussion points for today. So I'd like to start with these. And let's start by looking at the grid from the bottom up. So let's start at the end of the value chain with Mikel. Mikel, Iberdrola is going to be one of the first points of contact when it comes to delivering high volumes of electricity into people's homes and their businesses. Is this going to be a problem? How do you integrate the electrification of both transport and heating in your planning processes? And how does this affect your short and long-term views?
Okay, thank you, Emma, for the question. Let me try to share my screen. I've got a quick presentation. Right, I hope you can all see my screen now. Well, first of all, before I answer your question with regards to the impact of electric vehicles and heat pumps on the distribution system, which we'll get to, let me start by first clarifying what we see the role of electricity distribution companies should be in this context of decarbonization, because the reality is that our duty remains unchanged just because we are moving on to the context of decarbonization. I mean, we've always been committed to maintaining a network that has to be above all safe and of course reliable and cost efficient, and that remains the same. That does not change. There's only one way of doing that as far as I can tell, which is by adopting a coordinated distribution system planning approach, okay? And so far, I'm not saying much new because this is how we've always done it. But the reality is that today we've got one additional element, and it is a very relevant difference, which is that based on the investments that we've undertaken in digitizing our distribution system over the past 10-15 years, today we've got an unprecedented level of understanding of our distribution system itself, and we've got much more advanced tools that enable us to do a much better management of our distribution system itself. So having said that, let me show you an example of an exercise that we've recently been through precisely to assess how well prepared we are to face the challenges associated with the electrification of of transport and heating as we're talking. Okay, so from my slide, you can see that at the center of this exercise that we've just been through is an LV network power flow simulation engine that we've developed, where we simulate the conditions in 110,000 secondary transformers that we operate in Spain and 150,000 kilometers of low voltage circuits. Now, if the question that we are trying to answer is how well prepared we are to face the integration of those electric vehicles and heat pumps, there's two key elements that we need to answer before we can run this kind of simulation. On the one hand, we need to know where these heat pumps and electric vehicles are more likely to connect. And then on the other hand, we need to be able to establish how they are going to consume the energy that we're talking about. So to answer the first bit of the question I've just posed, the where element, we've got the clustering box on the left-hand side of my slide, which we need to address. We've developed a clustering model where what we've done is we've divided the whole of Spain into a grid of approximately 56,000 little squares, and we've characterized each one of those squares in terms of the level of income, in terms of some socio-demographic characteristics like average age, etc., etc. We've looked at unemployment rates, we've looked at weather areas, at the existing vehicle fleet, etc. And at the end of all that process, what we've been able to establish is where those electric vehicles and heat pumps are more likely to connect. And by that, I mean at which supply points they are more likely to connect, because that's a level of granularity we need to be able to undertake an assessment like we've just done. Once we know the where element, the other item we've had to address is an analysis of the demand patterns associated with electric vehicles and heat pumps based on the information that's readily available to us. And we've been able to overlay that onto our system information or our network topology, which we've got from our GIS system. Besides, we've combined that with the information from the hourly demand curves from the 11 million smart meters that we've got rolled out across our distribution area, and combining all of that into our simulation model, we've run about 350 simulation runs. In each one of those runs, we've established the network assets that are overstressed to some extent in each one of the conditions, and you can imagine that that is a very important input that we can integrate into our strategic investment planning processes, right? But if we jump onto the conclusions, one of the main conclusions that we've got to by undertaking this exercise is that in the short and the medium terms, the integration of the volumes of electric vehicles and heat pumps that we're talking about is not problematic. Now, does that mean that we're not going to have to do anything onto our distribution system? And when I talk about the short and medium terms, sorry, I'm talking about the next 10 years, okay? So the next decade. Does that mean we're not going to have to do anything up to 2030? Well, certainly not. We're going to have to undertake some localized network reinforcements. And as a matter of fact, you can see that we're going to have to address about 2% of our secondary transformer base in the next 10 years and approximately 1% of our low voltage network. So the key to this investment is that we invest where it is required and ahead of time to make sure that the capacity is there when the necessity arises. And if we look to change the horizon from 2030 to a more longer term approach, talking about the 2050, our view is that what we need is to continue to progress into our digitalization journey to be able to leverage the potential for flexibility associated with these new forms of demand, i.e. electric vehicles and heat pumps. In that sense, we've got some projects that we are progressing. And well, the objective is to make sure that the distribution network is certainly an ally to this decarbonization process. Okay, and that's all from my side. So I hand it back to you, Emma. Sorry, I think you're muted.
Great, sorry about that. Thank you, Mikel. Right, so let's move one level up on the value chain here from kind of distribution to transmission level. So Laurent, at ENTSO-E, you of course represent Europe's transmission system operators, and there are rapid changes in the electricity mix in Europe from both the supply and the demand side, which is creating plenty of disruption, as we all know, to our power systems. Is there anything that you can share with us from your modelling and analysis about the role of heat pumps in all of this? And are you concerned about grid stability now or even in the longer term?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me today into exchanging into this conference. I think it's very important to link the both upstream and downstream part of these new developments. As you rightly said, we all know that Europe is now heading towards being net zero in 2050. So that means a significant introduction of renewable resources on the main European system. And so that means basically a lot of change on how the grid is architected and needs to be reinforced to enable that. So what is clear is to reach this net zero target, we first need to do electrification as widely as possible. The electrification is the most efficient way to achieve this decarbonization. So that means introducing a lot of wind and solar PV into the main system. So we are talking probably around 2035 as per our modeling, with an electrical system which only runs out of renewables, apart from a specific backup capacity. And of course, given the intermittency which we see and the weather pattern which we see across Europe, that raises a lot of new challenges related to managing the grid stability and particularly the flexibility of the system. So what is going to happen intraday during periods where we have either no sun or fluctuation in wind, but also over various seasons when we'll see several days of the years without any PV and wind. How are we going to back up the system, maybe using green hydrogen and so on. So we have modeled all these developments. As part of that, we have tried to model what we see developing in the prosumer side, so in the end user side. So in our assumption, we have looked and anticipating the development of around 50 to 70 million heat pump between now and 2050, as well as 200 and 300 millions of electrical vehicles. So it is a very massive and rapid shift of all these end use. And of course, this is on one side a risk, but also a great opportunity, because these new devices are going to come with IoT and with capability to be able to be controlled, coordinated. And I think what is absolutely essential is to be able to think on what are the right level of interfaces between TSOs, DSOs, and these devices at what we call the edge of our systems, in order so that these devices actually use electricity when we have excess of renewable, which will happen during certain period of time. So that means probably negative prices in real time into the system, but not during the high peak condition, means low renewable and high peak loads, in which case hopefully we'll be able to shift these loads as widely as possible. So this is clear for us that the electricity system can withstand it. So there won't be blackout on that. But that raises a question on integrating these distributed energy resources at the level of prosumer. Thinking together heat pump with electrical vehicle is, for instance, very, very important. And so that raises the question on what will be the I would say system architecture behind that. We heard about the usage of data in the previous presentation, was very interesting. And so I think what we need is to connect and interconnect our data environment together. So ENTSO-E does publish a lot of transparency platform data. And by the way, the lollipop concept, which was presented in the previous slide, is already existing also in Europe in electricity map as an example. So how can we together inform end users so that they can really relate this down to their carbon footprint and basically be good citizens, if I may say so, from a system integration point of view. So that's absolutely essential from our ENTSO-E point of view.
Fantastic. And I'd like to move next to Enrique. I suppose, you know, we've spent a bit of time talking about the system, but I'd like to also talk about heat pumps, you know, themselves. Do you see heat pumps as responsible for grid instabilities, or is it more to the contrary that they could actually, maybe more as Laurent's implying with this flexibility point, could they actually contribute to a more stable grid?
Thank you, Emma. In fact, I'm quite agree with what I have heard already from Mikel and Laurent. In fact, well, first of all, we don't see heat pump as one independent system in the total network. So we see this process as common work we have to make all together. We mean the manufacturer of the heat pump, of course, but we need to talk about authorities, we need to talk about the installers, we need to talk about the network, we need to talk about utilities, we need to talk about everyone involved in that process. Our belief as Panasonic is, I think that already was said by Mikel and Laurent, is independently of how many heat pumps will be installed in the future, we are completely convinced there is no grid collapse at all. We will not see any blackout. But I think we need to differentiate to not see any blackout, to have responsibility on what type of heat pumps or what type of systems we are going to put in place. So for instance, we believe even if we could have a lot of heat pumps, probably we will all agree, we need to have the most efficient heat pump. If not, probably Mikel might have more issues with the net. If we bring, for instance, we have to say, if we compare today's in the market, from the lowest efficiency heat pump to the highest efficiency heat pump, there is up to 40% difference. So let's imagine a world where we allow those millions of heat pumps with the lowest possible efficiency. Probably the investment Iberdrola will have to make will be much bigger. So because it will be much bigger peak of electricity coming up to the market. So I think also what we say is, again, it's not only about heat pump. We believe heat pump will be part of a system. So we believe we need to have smart heat pumps coming up. So because again, I'm not sure if it is about PV, creating the electricity in the right time, or it's about wind generation. But what it is for sure coming is we will have some available energy. And we need to use it properly. And I think a very critical point, we need to use it in the right time. So it might happen charging the electric vehicle. It might happen heating up water that we will keep for the night. Or it might happen to go into PV, to battery. But the really important point is all those systems need to be connected. So everything should be, probably now we are talking a lot of IoT, we are talking about cloud. We need to have all those systems really interconnected. That brings me to a very important point. I think also, Laurent, you mentioned about that is we need some communication standards. So today, still, everybody is running in some direction. But frankly speaking, it's not only about the standards of certifying heat pumps, which is also really a challenge, but what is the right standard we will all use to communicate that probably might make this process run much faster. So for us, this is a critical point to overcome as well. Next point is all these types of things we are saying, if they have to happen, we need some regulatory process. We need incentive. We need financial frameworks. So it is not enough that each of us is making the best. So we need to bring the right framework to the market for that to happen. And as you said, on prosumers or consumers, so we need to educate the people. I like it, the Katie presentation, because the big issue we have today is we might create a fantastic process, but at the end of the day, the consumer does not know anything. And not only what to buy or how to buy it or how to use it, it might happen that finally they get a fantastic, extremely efficient heat pump, interconnected, etc., but they decide to use it standalone in bad manner. So we have to really work a lot on the consumers as well. So for us, as a summary, we believe the future of the heat pump and sustainability of the grid is basically based on an integrated smart system where IoT and smart control will make the best of the highly efficient heat pump and other related solutions, as already mentioned. We have, of course, very early stage, but I would invite you to check. We have already a case with Panasonic, Future Living Berlin. You can check in the website. We already create a type of concept like this, but I think it's a good example of what we can make up for the people. In fact, this is a social responsibility activity. We can make up for the people if we use the products in the right manner. So that would be Panasonic BUM.
Thank you. And finally, Philippe, I'd love to move on to you next. As a big player in the French market with EDF, how do you see the impact of heat pumps already in the network? And is there kind of anticipation that it's going to be as disruptive as some people fear?
Thank you, Emma, for the introduction. Please allow me to share my screen. I hope everybody can see the screen. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go for it. So the impact of heat pumps on the grid. So first of all, when we talk about the impact of heat pumps, in fact, we have to realize the impact of the heat pump will be much more limited than many people think. When you think about changing thermal heating by heat pump heating, everybody takes as a reference, of course, the terawatt hour consumed by the thermal boilers. But in fact, there are three elements which play on that comparison is basically not correct. First of all, we all know that heat pumps are very efficient. They use 3 to 4 times less power than the classical thermal boilers. But those 3 to 4 times, in fact, underestimate real effect, because in fact, they calculate where you should calculate on is final energy. So in fact, there are a lot of old boilers still around. In the best of worlds, they have, let's say, 70% efficiency. So in fact, the heat pump only needs to produce a 70% efficiency by the thermal boilers, which in fact means that the load and the power consumed by the current park of boilers, when you replace it by heat pumps, you should divide it by let's say between 4 and 6. And that 4 and 6 is only true if you do not change the insulation of homes. By the time we will have 50 or 90 million heat pumps in Europe, we will also live into a world where the houses will be much more insulated. So suppose you only increase by 2050 the efficiency of insulation of houses by 50%, then in fact, the difference between the current load of thermal heating, which is needed, and an eventual electrical load of heating, you can divide it by more than 10. So that's the first one. That's one which is probably relatively well known. The second one is when you look to the consumption curve of heat, what we see in France is the consumption which is asked by electrical heating in France on a winter day is relatively stable. So I can guess a lot of people think that the winter peak is because everybody switches on the heating, but this is not true. Reality shows that the average load of electrical heating in France is relatively stable on a winter day over the whole day. Secondly, so it is not responsible for the evening peak. The evening peak is generated by other type of loads. And thirdly, on the same, let's call it average winter day, electrical heating is responsible for about 30% of the base load and 20 to 25% of the peak load. I always have to take care that I do not use only 20 to 25% of the peak load, because in percentage it's low, it's still a sizable number of terawatt. But it means that 75 to 80% of the peak load is generated by other types of usage. And what we see, and we also work hard for it, what we see is that these other 75 to 80% is subject and is impacted by energy saving. The bulk of the evening peak is lighting, cooking, industrial processes, and they are subject to energy saving. Secondly, and this is typically maybe something which is typically for France, we have to realize that in France, 33% of population heats via electrical heating, and about 20 to 25% of population heats with very old, inefficient electrical heating, the very classical old electrical radiators. If you change those 20 to 25% of households, if you change the radiators by heat pumps, the savings the heat pumps will generate, because they will also reduce heating by a factor of 2 to 3, even if you don't touch insulation. That factor of 2 to 3 on 20 to 25% of the population, only that in France will allow the rollout for the next 25 to 30% of population on heat pumps, and you still keep the load exactly the same. It doesn't change. That might be a typical French effect, but it is a very sizable effect. So as a conclusion, when you look to the relatively limited demand for load and to the huge potential of energy saving on the other 3/4 of the load, the result is that the increase of heat pumps will lead to a limited increase of consumption and load if accompanied by a good energy efficiency strategy. And it will actually even allow a stable load. Now, it's not only me who says that, because you shouldn't believe me, but when I look in France, the Stratégie Nationale Bas Carbone, published December 2008, in fact, comes to the same conclusion. They have a scenario with a very pushed electrification, by the way, not alone of heating, and also with EVs and other use cases in it. And even now they predict an increase of the total energy consumption of only 0.5% to 1% a year, which is relatively limited. RTE also regularly does analysis of the peak. Their next study has been announced for the end of 2020, maybe with COVID, first quarter 2021. But they already announced that the impact of energy efficiency will compensate up to a large effect the rollout of heat pumps, and that as a consequence, the peak will stay globally stable, slightly higher than today, but in any case manageable. And in fact, this study confirms the results or an indication of their previous studies. And now when we talk about relatively stable to slightly maximally increasing peak, this peak will also be more manageable because the heat pumps will be connected. We see uptake of heat pumps vastly increasing on a customer base in France. We have started introducing systems whereby we can do steering of loads, which have success among customers. So we also did a lot of research on how you can use the thermal inertia of homes, even on insulated homes, to exploit the flexibility of heat pumps. We have tested this with and without additional thermal storage in the form of hot water storage, and you see that it works. So the peak generated by heating, which will stay relatively stable, will be more and more manageable. And to that, of course, you have to add the flexibility of all kinds of other flexibility stuff, which I'm not going to talk about. So, and let's not forget basically that a massive rollout of heat pumps is a condition for any successful strategy of decarbonization in housing. Without heat pumps, it will be extremely difficult to, let's call it virtually impossible, to decarbonize our heatings. So our conclusion is the technology is there, and I would only say, let's make it work. And then I agree with the other speakers, let's make it work. It means a lot of hard work on how to integrate the solutions, because I only talk about heat pumps, which is a separated technology with a lot of potential, but it needs indeed to be integrated in a global system, which allows individual homes and up to a larger extent areas to be managed. So that's my conclusion. Let's make it work.
Thank you. Since we've got a tiny bit more time before we end, I do have a few questions. Hopefully we can get through 2 of them before we conclude for today. The first one is just on kind of, we've talked a lot about flexibility and the use of smart heat pumps. I want to get some of your views on the barriers to actually rolling out flexible or smart heat pump solutions, and just some thoughts on whether, what are the biggest challenges that we have here? Is it the, cost of things like storage and insulation retrofits to actually benefit from things like thermal inertia in buildings? Is it the cost of the IoT or, the availability of these kind of technologies and getting people to perhaps have a smart meter installed alongside the heat pump system so that they, are interoperable and can talk to each other? So yeah, maybe we can start with Enrique and maybe Philippe. It would be great to hear your thoughts on these kind of, what are the barriers?
Thank you, Emma. In fact, I think I mentioned during my explanation, I would say having a common standard would be very important. So today, we need to somehow have one approach almost by manufacturer, and I would say even by country. So that is making the process quite slow. So I would say regulation on this sense and standards creation would be a fantastic support to make this happen. That's my view.
Yeah, I think when you look to the barriers of rolling out heat, it's a double question. What is the barriers of rolling out heat pumps, and what is the barrier of rolling out heat pumps in an integrated system? So let's say, I think that the main one for rolling out heat pumps is, are heat pumps profitable in the respective country? We did analysis on the different countries, and when heat pumps are a profitable investment for consumers, you have a market, and the market is increasing. There are a number of countries where, due to lack of subsidies, due to electricity pricing, or due to the difference of pricing between electricity and gas, heat pumps are not profitable, and you now simply don't have a market. So I think the first trick to make a successful rollout of markets is to set the conditions correctly between the pricing of electricity and the pricing of gas, whereby electricity in some countries is more taxed than gas. And in those countries, if you don't compensate it by subsidies, you simply don't have a market. Secondly, once it's profitable, you can sell it. It takes time to convince people. And I think in terms of solutions, what customers want, they don't want a separate solution of everything. I think it's being said by a number of speakers. The trick will be to come with a simple and integrated solution on which they can plug in their heat pump, their photovoltaic system, and their electrical cars. Because what we do need to realize is that heat pumps will be very often be bought in combination with photovoltaics or with an electrical car. In fact, the heat pump might be the trigger for the photovoltaics, or the photovoltaics might be the trigger for the heat pump. We see that happening more and more. So integrated solutions will have to be part of the game.
Thank you. And my last question, maybe Laurent and Mikel, it would be lovely to hear your thoughts on this. We've spoken a little bit about the policy, regulatory, and market frameworks that need to be in place to help, a smooth transition to high heat pump adoption. So it'd be nice to hear your views on, what actually needs to be in place to incentivize to consumers to actually use heat pumps in this way. Is it responding to a price signal? And for that, is it more desirable perhaps to have high adoption of flexible heat in residential segments, or maybe should we be targeting C&I end users for this kind of demand response angle? Mikel, would you like to go first?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. So I think from my perspective, I mean, when we talk about flexibility, one thing that we've got to bear in mind is that when we need flexibility to rationalize certain investments, we need a sufficient level of flexibility. And in that sense, managing the flexibility that residential premises can provide can be a little bit more challenging than that can provide commercial, because of the size of the flexibility they can provide. And in that sense, I would see that the development of the flexibility to leverage that potential from the bigger consumers would have a greater impact in the shorter term. And surely, if we want them to be engaged into this process, there needs to be a regulatory framework that has to be developed, and there will have to be some benefit from engaging into this kind of activity, and that should come in the form of an economic incentive, surely.
Yeah, maybe just to add on my side, I think in the clean energy package, there is really a lot of initiatives to unlock these new models. If I look what happens more in the main markets, it's a lot around intraday markets, enabling flexibility in intraday markets, real-time market, balancing markets, all gets kind of redesigned. So that's, and in the same time, the physics in the electrical system will significantly increase difference of price between periods of high renewable, where price of electricity will be highly negative, and periods of low renewable, where the price are going to be very expensive. So that will drive new revenue stream. And I would just like to say that the business model is going to shift, and the traditional peak load concept does not exist anymore in the future. And it's going to be various peaks during the day, with the duck curve situations already visible in Europe. So that's the upstream part. Downstream, I think what is very important is to enable prosumers straight into the real-time markets. We see this working in the Nordics, and I think what is very very interesting is to find a way as a community to explain to people it's actually an opportunity. It's not a risk, it's not a threat, it's an opportunity. When you have storage or heat pump at home, you actually have enough hardware to hedge against the potential volatility risk, and you actually have a business model to finance part of this equipment. So I think it's a shift of mindset. This is a need for doing open IoT and integration. And I'm very convinced the CEP is going to shift everything with between now and 2025. At least the TSO are working very hard right now into the market framework.
Thank you so much. Well, fantastic. That is kind of all we have time for today's session. And just to conclude, I'd like to send a really big thank you to the panelists and speakers for such an engaging discussion, and of course to the EHPA for pulling together such a great event. I will now pass back to Thomas. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Emma, for a great moderation. Thank you all also in this panel for demystifying some of the things that we have to work against in Brussels, that people, it's maybe an argument of last resort. You know, if these heat pumps are renewable and energy efficient and they reduce CO2 emissions and they even work in winter and in Switzerland and in Sweden and in renovation and in industry, but for sure they will create blackouts. So thank you for helping to put this into perspective, and I think we will see more development in this regard. This was a very technical panel, so maybe a bit different than the others, but before, with the cheering up of Katie before that, I think it was still appropriate. I hope to all of you that you enjoyed this afternoon. I do not want to stretch your patience any longer because we are 10 minutes over time. We had a great coverage of audience, more than 400 people registered, around 130 I saw quite continuously, dropping off a little bit at the end, but it's also a long day. So thank you for your patience, and bear with us for the decade of the heat pumps from 2020 to 2030. We will see millions of units installed. It's a great journey that we have just started. Looking forward to the developments, and really looking forward to physical meetings where we can give pins to everybody that has a heat pump as a small sign of progressiveness. And for all of you that don't have one yet, you have heard Katie write a sign that says that puts your pledge up. If you want, take a photo of yourself pledging that you will have a heat pump and post it online. How to serve the renovation wave is the topic of the day, is the topic of the next decade. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for my team for sitting here in the back office and solving all these small things when the links were not there or the person couldn't mute themselves. We have learned a lot about online tools. I think also here there's still some innovation potential. I would have loved to give everybody with a heat pump a small electronic badge, but that's not possible. I should write to Zoom. So the blue sky is fading into the night. And with that, I say goodbye. See you next time. Those of you that are in the EHPA, we will have a strategy meeting tomorrow where we will continue this discussion. Those of you that are in Australia, I will personally have a presentation with the Australian Heat Pumps Association tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock European time, or the equivalent in Australia. So if you want to learn more about that, you can also join that one. Thank you. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.